In this presentation, we want to take a look at Baroque painting in Italy. And when you talk about Baroque painting in Italy, the first name that comes up is Caravaggio. And Caravaggio is certainly the most influential and important innovator in painting in this time period. But of course, he was not the only painter. In fact, at first, he was not the leading painter even of the time. The leading painter of the time was Annibale Carracci. And Annibale Carracci did paintings something like this, which are very filled with movement and action, the way we would think of in a Baroque period, but they look stylistically quite a bit like Renaissance paintings. They're still populated by the same kinds of characters, and they still use the same kind of all-over lighting that we see. And this one is really unusual because it is a ceiling fresco, and that was a common thing in the Baroque period, basically because of the popularity and fame of the Sistine Chapel. Once the Sistine Chapel had been painted by Michelangelo, a lot of other people wanted to have glorious paintings on their ceilings as well. So the Farnese family, very wealthy family, hired Carracci to paint this vaulted ceiling, and he painted it structurally kind of like the Sistine Chapel. We have this central row of paintings going down the middle, and we even have architectural elements painted to look as if they're holding the various panels in place. So it definitely takes a lot of inspiration compositionally from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. I think what's different about it and what makes it Baroque is that these panels all look like they could be moved around. They look like you could shift them and put them in different places, whereas in Michelangelo's Renaissance masterpiece, the panels are all very much locked into place in their architectural setting. So the potential or the illusion of potential movement is one of the things that makes this kind of more of a Baroque painting than the Renaissance. And this painting on ceilings was very popular, and very often became very ostentatiously almost bombastic. So in this painting we see the Barberini family, not to be outdone by the Farnese family, has this painting that glorifies their wonderful name and the heritage of their family. And we see the ceiling is kind of blown away. We call this an exploded ceiling. It looks as if we're looking up out of the roof has been removed, and we're looking right up into the heavens themselves, and something, amazingly supernatural is going on up there with sort of all of the choirs of angels in heaven, and they are glorifying the name of the Barberini, the heraldic symbolism of the name Barberini. And but this is all very different from what we have from Caravaggio. Caravaggio comes along and he gives us paintings like this, which are striking, even shocking in how different they are. And the first thing that we notice about them is how dark his paintings are. And this darkness even gives this style of painting a name. It's called tenebrism, and it means the dark style. But the thing that makes the dark work is the very strong directional light that's in the painting. And the light is almost like the lighting of a spotlight on a theater stage. It's so directed and active and powerful in the scene. And this is one of the things that sets Caravaggio's paintings apart, is the way he uses light almost as if it is a forceful character, the very protagonist of the action. The other thing that we see in Caravaggio's paintings is that the perspective is such that it puts the viewer right into the scene very directly. We're not gazing from afar or looking in awe from far below the ceiling. We are right there in this scene. It's right in our faces, and we almost seem like we're participants in it. And so the direct and forceful perspective of Caravaggio's paintings is also something that makes them stand out and be different. They have a gritty realism to them. So this is a very unusual painting. It's a religious painting. It's the Conversion of St. Paul, but you wouldn't necessarily know that right away. It just looks like someone fell off a horse, and this horse dominates the painting. And it's a very unusual thing for a religious painting that's in a church to be so almost completely taken up by this horse's body. So that's striking and unusual. And then the characters themselves are not the typical idealized characters that we're used to seeing in the Renaissance and other Baroque paintings. We look at this horse handler in the back. He's kind of a homely sort. He's wrinkled and he's middle-aged looking, and he doesn't look like the kind of people that we expect to be populating our great religious works of art. And these things were the elements that made Caravaggio's paintings popular and unpopular, because some people didn't like this. Some people didn't like having the unfortunate end of a horse, dominating a religious painting. And they didn't really like these sort of homely characters and the grittiness of these scenes. But Caravaggio wanted you to feel as if you were really there in the midst of this event. And in this event is the conversion of St. Paul, who, while riding to Damascus, his job was to persecute Christians and stamp out Christianity. He was struck blind temporarily by a light, and he heard a voice asking him why he persecuted the Lord. And so we see this in the moment of the conversion, and that should remind us a little bit of the way Bernini depicted David in the midst of his battle against Goliath. So this very Baroque idea of capturing the moment of action. So dramatic lighting, this idea of being in the moment, the forceful perspective, and the gritty realism all sort of contribute to the elements that Caravaggio introduced into painting at this time. And the paintings were recognized as being kind of strikingly different. Here's another very strikingly different painting that is actually right across the room, a very small room, as a matter of fact, from the conversion of Paul, is the crucifixion of Peter. So at the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome, you can see both of these paintings, and they're maybe 10 feet apart from each other, and they are really both very dramatic scenes. And in this scene, we see Peter being crucified upside down, as according to legend he was, and Caravaggio does this very unusual thing where he turns the crucifixion into an act of labor, so that we don't just think of poor Peter, hanging there to die, but rather we think of all the work that actually goes into the crucifixion of a human being. And so we see the crouching fellow on the ground, still grasping the shovel, lending his back into the work. We see the other guy wrapping his arms around the ankles and pulling up the cross, and we see a third man with a rope across his back, lending his efforts to this gruesome task. And this is all a very unusual take on the scene, because Caravaggio wants us to feel like we are there. What was it really like to be there when this happened? And another example of his really gritty realism is down in the lower left corner. We see the bottoms of this guy's feet, and we see that they're dirty. They're caked with dirt. And even if you have a chance, and I hope you do, to go see this painting in real life, you'll see that there is dirt under his toenails. And this is an incredible amount of detail and realism, which is really best described as gritty. And so to make things real, to make things gritty, and to make things dramatic and powerful. This same kind of interest in the work effort involved can be seen in the next painting. We look at this painting, which is the entombment of Christ, and we see that Jesus's family and loved ones have gathered around to lay him in his tomb, and we see the effort again. We see that this is hard. We see this is a difficult task, and that the weight of the dead body that they're laying into the tomb is heavy and awkward and causes them a difficulty. And who exactly are they handing him down to? Well, it seems that they're handing his body down to us. I mean, we are very, very, again, placed in the scene. It's almost as if we're waiting below in the excavated grave to receive the body as it's being handed down to us. So again, we have this immediacy of the composition. We have the way that Caravaggio turns it into effort and work, and lends a drama and an atmosphere to the scene. Something else to note, kind of a footnote or side note here, is something interesting about this painting, which is related to the fact that Caravaggio is a nickname. Caravaggio is his nickname. The man's given name was Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, from Caravaggio. And this fact that his real name was Michelangelo was something that definitely was on Caravaggio's mind very frequently. And he saw himself in the sort of competition with his much more famous namesake, Michelangelo Buonarroti. And sometimes in his paintings, we can see him pay homage to Michelangelo, and this one is a good example. So if we look at the body of Jesus being lowered into the tomb, it should remind us very clearly of the Pietà by Michelangelo, because the bodies are very similar in their postures and poses. Especially you see that limp right arm hanging down, and the way in each case a hand is reaching up under the armpit to hold Jesus's body. On the left, we have Jesus being held by his companions, and on the right, we have the Pietà, and that is Mary's hand holding up Jesus's body in very much the same way. And then there are the bent legs and the head tilted back of Jesus. And so we have this very strong indication that Caravaggio is thinking about Michelangelo and thinking about the fact that he is rendering an image of Christ's dead body, and he wants to do it in a very similar manner to sort of echo and pay homage to Michelangelo Buonarroti. That similarly can be seen in this painting, and we'll talk more about this painting in a moment, but I just want to talk for a moment about how this painting also carries a bit of an homage to Michelangelo Buonarroti. In this painting, Jesus is entering into a darkened tavern, and he's pointing to Matthew, who he's calling to join him as one of his apostles. And as he walks in from the right-hand side, he extends his arm, and his hand points, but it points with a very unusual gesture. And the hand that Jesus extends there is very, very reminiscent, really almost a copy, of Adam's hand from the Sistine Chapel. And if we look at the two hands, very close comparison, we'll see that they're mirror images of each other. And so this is something that we find curious and interesting about Caravaggio, is the fact that his real name was Michelangelo, and he compared himself in his career to the great Renaissance master Michelangelo. And when he could, he slipped in these references and recognized the greatness of his predecessor by paying homage to him in these ways. So it's really kind of an interesting footnote to the career of Caravaggio. But back to this painting. So this painting is very powerful, with the light streaming in from the right-hand side and striking Matthew on the face. Matthew is there pointing to himself because Matthew was surprised to be chosen. Matthew, as a tax collector, he was unpopular among the people who knew him, and he was an unusual choice to become a religious follower of Jesus. And so there is this surprise. One thing that may not be immediately evident to modern eyes is that this table where these people are crowded around is actually a group of tough guys. And you have to not let the feathers and the silken sleeves fool you, but recognize the fact that these guys are carrying weapons. The weapons of the Baroque period are swords, and the people who would look at this painting would recognize that what Caravaggio is presenting is a very dark, shadowy group of people who are huddled around counting money, and there's kind of a dangerous group of guys, and that Jesus is walking right up to them and singling out one of them and telling him to come follow him on a religious life is very, very powerfully striking. So sometimes the costumes of the period can throw us off, but that's the message that's being conveyed here, and it's a message that the people of the 1600s would have certainly understood. So this painting is a great example of the drama, the use of light and shadow so dramatically, the grittiness and the realistic atmosphere that Caravaggio created, and how different it is. And let's take a little bit of a look at a few of his most famous devotees, artists who were very influenced by him. And staying right in Italy, when we look at the influence of Caravaggio, one Italian artist who was very clearly influenced by him was Artemisia Gentileschi. And Artemisia Gentileschi is a fascinating character in her own right, as a female artist at this time who really became well known and is highly regarded as a powerfully talented artist in herself. And she painted this scene from the Old Testament called Judith slaying Holofernes, and she presents the scene in a really pretty gruesome way, in a very Baroque, violent way. In the very moment of the beheading, blood is spraying everywhere. It's in the midst of the act. But very interestingly, she also paints the women in the scene very powerful, and they are made to be strong. They are not dainty, nymph-like waifs that we're used to seeing in perhaps a Botticelli painting, sort of flitting about the scene. They are powerful, real people. And that is another element of Caravaggio's influence, I think, is to make people real. Another painting by Artemisia Gentileschi of basically from the same story is Judith and her handmaiden bundling up the decapitated head into a bag, and they stop momentarily because perhaps they hear a noise, and Judith puts up her hand to take a moment before they proceed. And the whole scene is lit by this one candle, which throws everything into, again, a very dramatic lighting situation, deep, deep darks. And again, we see these women are powerful, real women, rather than the sort of Renaissance supermodel ideal types. If we go to Spain, one of the big major painters of Spain is Diego Velázquez, and he is certainly influenced by Caravaggio, the use of light and deep shadows, and also the ordinariness of his characters. He presents us with very normal-looking folks, not idealized Renaissance perfect people. And he is a master at representing all sorts of different textures and materials, the clear crystal goblet in the center, the rough peasant-made pottery that we see in the foreground, and even the droplets of water that are running down a splash on that coil-built pot that we see in the very near ground. All of this influence of Caravaggio in the gritty realism of the scene. And in Holland, we have Rembrandt, of course, the very famous artist from Holland, very much influenced by Caravaggio, again with the strikingly powerful light and the deep, deep darks. and that capturing of the moment. In this painting, when Abraham is about to sacrifice his son Isaac, he's stopped at the last moment by an angel who intervenes. And look, in the midst of this scene, Abraham has let go of the sacrificial knife, but it has not yet fallen to the ground. So it's in midair, suspended, because this is a split-second moment. And again, that would remind us of Bernini's David as well. So the influence of Caravaggio is far and wide, and he really introduced an entirely new way of painting, a way of painting that was both dramatic and realistic, and used this strong contrast of bright, powerful light and deep, dark shadow to create a startling and shocking effect.